Bells of San Carlos by Max Brand. Fray Luis was so used to his friar's robe tugging at his knees and a wash about his feet that he felt naked in cotton trousers and kept looking down at them and at the thinness of his legs. As for the huaraches at his feet, he was used to sandals just about like them, so they made no difference. But he could not grow accustomed to the new lightness of his step and to the absence of that windy whispering which for 30 years had been about his ankles. He could endure perfectly well the cheap shirt with its tails worn outside his trousers, but he was ashamed to let even the buzzards see his ragged straw hat, the true peon's hat with some handmade cigarettes tied to the brim. All through the Manatia Mountains he had walked with his shame, and though he knew that a man about to die should fix his thoughts on higher things and clothes, still his mind dwelt more on that straw hat than on the purpose which already had taken him 1,000 miles from safety. However, when he came to the side of the valley, his heart stopped. His whole world rocked and staggered before his eyes, for the tower of the convent church and the white walls around it no longer stood in the middle of the flat. It was long since he and all the brotherhood had been driven from San Carlos de Piedras, and he knew that accidental fire, 6 months before, had ruined the old buildings. But even if it were an empty skeleton, he had expected to see it rising high above the ground. Instead, it was a mere stumbling heap, and it seemed to Fray Luis that all the prayers of centuries and all the sweet song of the bells from the tower were collapsed and gone from heaven as the monastery from earth. He felt that this could not be true, but he was such a simple man that the visual loss was like a death of the spirit also. He almost doubted that this could be San Carlos after all, but the mountains looked down on the valley with the same bald heads, the same furrowed faces. So Fray Luis dropped on his knees, prayed for the mercy of God upon the dead and for the preservation of all the masses, all the music, all the incense smoke which had gone upward in their name, and then he rose, strengthened and comforted, and started forth across the level land. He felt that he was walking in mortal peril. There had been a time when he knew every man, woman, and child in the valley, when he could call every burrow by name, and in those gentle days no eye looked upon him except with love, and even the dogs which rushed out savagely at a passer-by would silence their tongues when they knew it was Fray Luis. Now the hearts of men had changed. The new regime had found new creatures to abide by the new law, and there was death abroad in the land for men of the church. His disguise had taken him safely enough through the mountains, but in San Carlos Valley every eye was apt to know him. That was why the brotherhood had wept when he departed on the mission. Now, as he walked deeper into the valley, he was trying to imagine in what form death would come to him. It was evening. He had lingered during the last march so as to arrive at just this hour of the day, and now the night gathered over him as he came near to San Carlos. The very smell of the cookery meant home to Fray Luis. For the savor of roast kid is nowhere in the world like its fragrance in San Carlos, and the pungent sweet sour of beans never is breathed, really, except in San Carlos. The stomach of Fray Luis grew as empty as a church bell without its clapper, and he almost forgot his terrors until a clamor of dogs came rushing out of the village. It seemed to the poor friar that they must have scented him and were dashing to put their teeth in his flesh. But then a thin ghost of a creature whipped past him through the dark of the night, and he realized that it was a coyote with the town curs in pursuit. The whole clamor rushed off through the darkness, and Fray Luis went straight on to the ruins. When he reached them, he had lamplight from the neighboring houses and starlight from heaven to see by. But his tears filled his eyes with darkness, and he had to sit for a long time on the base of a pillar before he could look about him. At last Fray Luis raised his head very slowly. He could not believe that the huge old beams actually had rotted in the flame. But when he had dried his eyes, he made sure that the church and the monastery were indeed gone. It was hard to guess where one wall had stood, but as he crept about through the wreckage, the plan of the old building returned to his mind, and he found himself looking up to where once the flat head of the bell tower had leaned against the stars. The crypt entrance had laid back of that about 20 paces. He made those paces, marked the place, and then began to clear away the ruin. It was hard work, slow work. He had brought with him a short, heavy iron crowbar to help his hands, but the big flat adobe bricks are almost as tough as fire-baked clay, and they stuck together in ponderous clots which he barely could lift and roll. All that night he worked. Just in the dawn, he came down to a stone pavement. Wearily he cleared a larger space, but at last he realized that he had been mistaken. His dizzy brain had remembered steps, and now he found them, but they were steps leading up into the sacristy, not down into the crypt. No, for the crypt lay far off on the other side of the entire building. By this time it was clear daylight, so that Fry Lewis dared not attempt to steal off through the town. Instead, he curled himself up among the ruins and fell into a deep sleep, exhausted. By mid-morning, the intense heat had roused him. All the blood of his body was gathered in his poor old head, but in the ruins there was no shade, and he was afraid to show his face. So, through that sweltering day, he endured an agony stronger than anything he had known before. For he had drunk up all his water during the night, and this fire-hot sunshine sucked the moisture swiftly out of his body. The torment was worse even than that march of his through the mountain snows when one January he had carried medicine and good news to the little village of San Jose. He had felt for years that that was the supreme test of his endurance, but this day was worse, burning him like coals in a brazier. At last the day turned red. The evening rolled down like purple smoke from the Monotilla Mountains, and then the stars shone once more. Thirst was swelling his tongue, but he dared not get a drink until the last noises had ended in the town. Therefore he forced his trembling hands to labor again, after he had marked, as well as he could, the probable position of the crypt entrance. It was nearly morning before the last dog-fight and serenade had ended. Then Fray Luis crawled out from the ruin and got to the well. The very smell of the moisture made him impatient. He could almost have eaten the wet earth around the well where careless village girls had spilled gallons from their water jugs. Turning slowly, the handle that wound up the rope and lifted the bucket, he managed so that the bucket rose with no more noise than the exquisite and tempting music of water adrip. Now it was in his grasp with the image of a star shattering and forming and wavering in the water. Fray Luis drank with such joy that when he had to pause to take breath, his conscience smote him. Never before had he taken such joy in the pleasures of the flesh. He looked up to heaven, therefore, to ask forgiveness of God, and then drank again, filled his canteen, and went back to the ruins. In fact, the water seemed to weigh upon him more than sin. He was weak, and his hands stumbled and fumbled at their work all the rest of the night, and when the morning sounds told him to stop, he had not mined down through the heaped adobe bricks to the pavement. That second day in the open face of the furnace, he endured with only the strength of patience. 48 hours without food drank up the old man's strength, and he looked into the northwest for that rare mercy of rain which came to San Carlos hardly more than twice a year. Once, when he was praying for rain in the open plaza under the eyes of the people, thunderheads actually rolled out from the northwestern mountains, and within an hour the rain had fallen on the valley. It was because of that miracle that he had been chosen by the Brotherhood to return to the ruins of the convent in search of the treasure. Today he whispered his prayer, and still the sky remained white-hot. Fray Luis was the humblest man in the world, and he was sure that the good saint would not favor one mortal with two signs. He roused out of a stupor like sleep late in the day, with a sense upon his lips and in his dry throat of words just uttered and still fresh in his ear. And as he opened his eyes, he saw a shadow draw back from the hollow in which he lay. He was sure that prayer aloud in his sleep had brought curious eyes upon him. By degrees, his heart trembling and his breath gone, Old Louis stood up half his height and peered about him, but he saw no living thing among the tumbled rubbish of bricks. So he took another sip of lukewarm water from the canteen and sat down again, giving thanks. Thereafter, out of another drowsy trance, he aroused to find the mercy of the night already in the skies, and still there was life left in him for his work. But he realized that all his power soon would be gone, and so he resumed his work even before the village sounds had been lost in sleep. He moved with the greatest care, breaking up the adobe clutterings and getting deeper and deeper until the crowbar fell from his hands and made a sound in its fall like the far-off ghost of a chime of the bell of San Carlos. That disaster kept him trembling for half an hour, but still no one approached, and he went on with his labor until he could have sworn he was well beneath the pavement level, and then his hand touched a stone edge as high as his knee. He was below the floor of the church. He had been so lucky that he had struck exactly above the crypt entrance, and now he was working on the steps. This discovery gave him fresh strength. The old man looked up at the stars and felt suddenly that he was not alone in his work. And now good fortune overtook him in a great sweep, for a moment later his crowbar struck through the adobe at his feet. He enlarged that hole eagerly. Some of the adobe fell inward, and the whole latter half of the steps into the crypt was clear. So, in a sort of magnificent single gesture, he arrived at the last stage of his mission. He lighted the candle which he had carried with him all that distance from the sea. It was crooked, but it lighted readily, and as he stood on the lower pavement, the vaults grew out of nothing and walked back in ordered ranges of stubby little columns. Looking down, he found that he actually was standing on the flat gravestone of the good and great brother, Fray Tonio, and it seemed to poor Luis that the sad, patient voice of the dead man rose out of the ground, once more reproaching him for the badness of his Latin. Fray Luis dropped to his knees and kissed the stone. When he stood up again, he had to use both hand and candlelight to fumble his way forward into that corner where the treasure of San Carlos was hidden. Before he touched the sunken stone in the wall corner, he looked up to pray and knocked his head against the low curve of the vault. He pushed resolutely against the stone, and it tipped promptly, revealing a dark little niche with a bright eye gleaming out of the shadow. Fray Luis fell on his knees again and gave thanks to God and San Carlos. Then he pulled out the little silver box and opened it. The very answer to prayer was inside. He lifted delicately the edges of the holy silk, which was folded inside the box, and saw the yellow glint of the 2 finger bones. Fray Luis leaned a moment against the wall, sick with joy. Then he closed the open niche, took the bones in their silken wrapping, and placed the parcel gently inside the leather wallet where he had carried the food for his journey. He had risen to his feet and turned with the candle before he heard even a whisper of sound. It was the small, dry rattling made by a rolling bit of adobe on the stone steps, but his candlelight shone on the faces of 3 savage men. The shadow of unkemptness was on their chins. The hunger of years sucked in their cheeks and polished their cheekbones, and greed brightened their eyes in the candlelight. "Ah, Domingo," whispered Fray Luis, for he recognized one of the 3. But that recognition brought him little ease, for Domingo was an unholy gambler and user of the knife. "Talk to the old wolf," said another of the men. "Talk to him, Domingo, and tell him." The 3rd fellow darted into the corner and ran back, carrying the little silver reliquary in his hands. "Here's a part of it," he said. "Look, Jose." "It's only the first drop from the cup," said Jose. "Talk to him, Domingo." Domingo already had Fray Luis by the shirt collar. His knuckles, edged and hard as stone, bit into the windpipe of the friar. "Listen, Fray Luis," said Domingo. "We know that you friars lived here like fat gophers in a hole for 400 years, and when you were kicked out you hadn't a chance to take your hoard along with you. Now they've grown thin, and they've sent you here to take a load of their treasure out to them. Instead of that, you're going to open the walls for us and show us the hidden room that's stacked with the silver bars and the vases full of gold coins and the boxes of jewels that you stole, you dogs, off the hands of dead women for 400 years. The enormity of these words left the old man calm. He said, San Carlos be my witness. There is not a jewel. There is no gold. The only silver is this little reliquary, and the only hidden place is this turnstone in the wall. He walked to it, pressed it, and showed them the crevice. Their hands instantly were in the hollow and came out empty. "And you came," said Domingo, taking the new grip of his collar, "for this little silver box only?" "See how he keeps his face," said Jose. "They learn to lie in Latin, and then it's no wonder they lie in Spanish better than other men. Make him talk, Domingo." "Fray Luis," said Domingo, "be a sensible old man. If you don't show us the stuff now, you will later on, and it's better to talk while your skin is still on. Come, come! You're more an old woman than a man, and though you shake your head at us now and look up to heaven, there's not a saint of them all that will come down to this cellar to help you now. Will you talk?" "I tell you in the name of heaven the sacred truth," said Fray Luis, "that there is no gold, no treasure of silver, no jewels." He saw Domingo take his quirt by the lash and swing up the loaded handle, and for an instant Fray Luis recoiled, but when he realized how his flesh was shrinking, he made himself sway forward to meet the blow. He had made up his mind with a sudden effulgence of the spirit that should have made a brightness through the crypt. In his swimming vision there were pictures of saints overwhelmed with rocks, stuck full of bleeding arrows, boiled in cauldrons of steaming oil, but always with upward eyes upon a glory that enabled them to forget their pain. So the old man looked up, but this blow seemed to cleave through flesh and brain pan. The breath went out of him, and darkness entered. Afterward, he heard a voice saying, "You've killed him, you fool. If you've killed him, we'll stretch your neck for you. There never were any more wits in your hands, Domingo, than in the hoofs of a cow. He's dead. You see, he hardly bleeds at all." "Bah," said Domingo confidently. "All the blood was dried out of him years ago. You could boil down an old friar for glue. You see, his eyes are opening." Fray Luis was rousing to a terrible pain. Still the fire ate inward through his brain, and the terror ran into the pit of his belly with a dreadful nausea. He sat up. One eye was closed entirely. Something trickled down his face. The salty taste of blood entered his mouth. He remembered his Uncle Miguel taking his slender arm between finger and thumb until the bone ached. "This little one will do for the church," he had said. And ever since, the fear of the world had lurked for Luis behind a hill. Now it rushed out upon him with the face of a dragon. "Take him away from the town, and we'll make him talk," said Domingo. "But don't let him squeal in here, because if the people come and find him, they might be rough with us. They love the old fool, because one day it happened to rain while he was praying." So they put a dirty cloth into the mouth of Fray Luis, stuffing it in so that he scarcely could breathe, and then they lifted him by the hair of the head. He could be sure, therefore, that his prayers were silent when they carried him through the night and put him on the back of a mule behind Jose. And all the jolting way, while the pain tortured his head and the fear worked on his heart with cold fingers, he begged San Carlos that he might be able to hold his peace about the treasure, which was more valued than all the gold and jewels in the world, the blessed relics of the saint that were in his pocket. Or was it better that they should fall into the hands of thieves than to be lost with his body? No. For San Carlos, when he wills, can lead good men with a brighter ray than any star may cast, and at his choice he would have the holy relics again in cherishing hands. They reached a little shanty with a shed behind it, and dismounted at the open door, dragging Fray Luis forward until they were stopped by a strange picture. The rising moon slanted into the cabin, a dimness of light by which the friar partly saw and partly guessed at a dreadful figure. There was a staggering little wooden table with a brandy bottle on it, and a big hand grasping the bottle, and an arm clad in a blue flannel shirt that was open at a breast black with hair, and then a red face, loose in the jowls and hard in the nose and the brow. By the insolent glare of the eyes, the friar guessed this to be a gringo. All Americans, as Fray Luis knew, served the devil in sundry ways, but in this terrible man he could see the complete servant of the fiend. "What drunken gringo!" began Jose. "Sew up your mouth and be still," gasped Domingo.
Mother of heaven, it is Senor Charles himself.
Mr. Charles, you swine, said the gringo. And what do you mean by keeping hogs swizzle like this inside a good brandy bottle?
Senor Charles, said Jose, forgive the heat which corrupts good brandy as fast as flies blow a carcass.
An amazement as vague and all-pervasive as the moonshine invaded Fray Luis. For here were 3 armed and desperate men who shrank before that single figure by the brandy bottle. Senor Charles said in his heavy, thick voice, "What are you doing with a man so old?" A faint thrill of hope sprang in the heart of the friar, though from this hairy monster, ugly as a tarantula inside its trapdoor, he expected no real mercy.
Old Senor Charles, but evil, said Domingo, with the Senor's permission.
He lighted a lantern that hung beside the door, and, holding it high, showed the thin face, the blinking eyes, and the tonsured head of the man of the church. "Ah, hell! Is that all it is?" said the gringo. "Take it away and do your dirty work out of my sight and my hearing. That's all. Vamoose!" So they took Fray Luis into the cattle shed and tied him to the center post. They stood about him.
"Will you talk?"
asked Jose. "There is no gold," began Fray Luis.
"Try the quirt again, but the light end of it," said Jose.
Domingo grinned, spat on the floor, and slashed Fray Luis across the face with the lash of the whip. The old man took breath, stunned with pain so that the scream in his throat would not come out.
"Gag him before he yells," said Jose. "There's no use in annoying the gringo dog. No one can tell what he will think when he's drunk, but we all have heard what he can do."
The dirty rag was pushed between the teeth of the poor friar. He began to choke so that his eyes ached, and Domingo laid on the lash with a frenzy of pleasure. He kept stepping back and forth to give greater play to the quirt. He twisted his entire head and body with every blow so that the friar saw only in glimpses the white shine of the teeth as Domingo grinned at his work. And in his expert grasp, the lash whistled in the air and struck the flesh like hand claps. Fray Luis tried to pray, but even in his mind there was nothing but screaming.
"He's strangling,"
said Jose at last. He dusted ashes from the end of a cigarette with the little finger of the hand that held it. The little finger had a nail as long as the nail of a Chinese gentleman.
"Take the gag out before he chokes."
They took out the gag. The tongue of Fray Luis ached from pressing against it. He thought, in fact, that he would die at once of the stifling and the agony. The whip had cut him like a knife in a dozen places, and still more than the pain was the horrid sense that human hands were striking him, beating down his heart, making a dog of him. At last he could draw a clean breath, and when it came out from his lips again, he listened with all his might, but made sure that he had not screamed. At this, he knew San Carlos stood unseen beside him, and at a stroke half his agony left him. He felt that if only he could see out of both eyes, he would be able to look death in the face.
"Now, will you talk, old fool?"
asked Jose. Fray Luis said nothing. His thoughts were high above the roof of that shed. Jose faced Domingo.
"We'll have to kill the pig then,"
said Jose after a moment.
"Fray Luis, will you talk?"
Domingo took out a long six-shooter and played with it. "Yes, yes, I will talk," groaned the friar.
"Out with it, then,"
said Jose. Fray Luis held up his shaking hands. He said in bad Latin, "I confess to Almighty God, to Blessed Mary, ever a Virgin, to Blessed Michael the Archangel, to Blessed John the Baptist, to the holy apostles Peter and Paul, to all the saints, especially to San Carlos, and to you, brethren, that I have sinned exceedingly in thought, word, and deed." He struck his breast 3 times and added, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. Therefore, I beseech you to pray to the Lord our God for me." A voice said, "May Almighty God have mercy upon you, forgive you your sins, and bring you to life everlasting. Amen. But what damned bad Latin you pray in, brother." Fray Luis, looking toward the door of the shed, saw outlined in the early dawn the hulking shoulders and the great head of the gringo. He walked into the lantern light that filled the little place.
Senor Charles,
said Jose. Be silent, said the renegade white. The brandy bottle which he carried in his left hand he lifted to his lips and took a swallow. Then he drew a gun. I told you to take him out of my sight. But I could hear the whip strokes, Jose, and they disturbed me. What is this fellow?
A sneaking rat of a friar who was prowling around the ruins, said Jose. And when we make him talk, we'll all be rich. There'll be mule loads of gold and bar silver, Senor Mister, and...
He won't talk, eh? Said Senor Charles. He walked to the friar and leaned above him. With a forefinger as hard as a wooden peg, he pushed back the head of Fray Luis and looked down into his face with reddened eyes. You came back to San Carlos like a brave old fool, did you? Asked the gringo. And now you won't talk? He raised his voice to thunder. You won't talk? He shouted. Fray Luis closed his eyes to shut out the frightful vision. The monster half seen in the moonlight had been dreadful enough, but standing now at his full height, his face swollen with greedy evil, his mouth slewed to the side so that the teeth looked out, he was to the friar the incarnation of the master fiend himself. Fray Luis tried to pray, but the divine name which rose in his throat was altered by the movement of his lips. Mercy, Senor Charles, he heard himself whispering. In that moment he felt that he had lost his grasp on the verge of that heaven to which, through the sweet pain of martyrdom, he was about to ascend. Mercy be damned, said the fiend who stood above him. Why should there be mercy for a scrawny old woman like you with calluses on your knees instead of on your hands? You were sneaking around the ruins of the church, were you? Well then, what have you found? Fray Luis opened his eyes and looked up, envisioning the face of sweet San Carlos, but all he saw was the lowering gringo, more terrible than ever. Fear ran like water through the veins of Fray Luis, and tears came into his eyes. I am unworthy, and therefore I am abandoned, moaned the friar. Do you hear, you fool? Growled the gringo. What brought you back to the church, and what did you find there? He stooped down. Hush, said Domingo to the other two. What a man is this Senor Charles? He does with his voice what we could not do with a whip. The old rat is about to talk. It seemed to Fray Luis that he was compelled to obey the gringo. He took from its wrappings a soft little swathing about the finger bones, the blessed relics of the saint, and held them forth. Pure as old ivory, time-polished, they lay in the palm of his hand. The blunt fingers of the gringo seized instantly upon them. Domingo and the other two uttered a vague outcry that was to the friar like the laughter of all the devils in hell. What is it? Is it a key? Called Jose. This is the treasure, eh? Snarled Senor Charles. Ah, senor, sobbed Fray Luis. It is one of the keys to heaven. By the living saints, said the gringo. I think it is, for you. He jerked his big body about and waved a hand. Get out, the three of you. Senor Charles, screamed Domingo. But give us the key. It is we who found. Out! Out! Roared Senor Charles. Amigos, brothers, help me, yelled Domingo, and snatched out a heavy gun, a blue-gray flash of steel. Huh? Said the gringo. He did not raise his own revolver much higher than his hip when he fired. Fray Luis heard the big half-inch slug strike the body like a fist. Domingo lurched back against the wall, the wind knocked out of him in a grunt. Then he slipped down in a pile. His head was between his knees. He seemed to be making a sort of collapsed oriental salaam to some superior power. The gringo faced the other two as they backed toward the door. The drink kept his body wavering and the legs sagging at the knees, but his head and his hand were steady. Give me a little room, Jose, said the gringo. Elbow room. Room to breathe. Get over there beyond the edge of the sky, and don't come inside the horizon with me again, or I'll be crowded. He walked with his wobbling knees to the door after them. Hoofbeats began. An angry voice screamed an insult out of the distance. Then the gringo came back and cut the rope that tied Luis to the pillar. The old man tried to stand, but the effort set his knees to shuddering. He was much amazed when the gringo picked him up and carried him to the hut. When did you eat last? Asked the gringo. There's no more belly on you than there is on a starved sheep."
"I ate on the Holy Sabbath," said Fray Luis.
"And in between?" asked the American.
"I have had good water from the well of San Carlos. God and the saint be praised for it," said Fray Luis. "But now, let me die."
"Why should you die, brother?" asked Senor Charles, leaning the red and swollen horror of his face closer to the old man.
"Because I have given up with my own hand the salvation of thousands, of tens of thousands," said Fray Luis, "and God will not have mercy on my soul."
He began to weep. It seemed to him that the tears were the last blood in his body. "As for the key to heaven," said the gringo, "you see that it is once more in your hand."
It was true. The miraculous relics were again in his grasp. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away,"
whispered the friar.
"The Lord giveth."
And as he stared at the gringo, words left him. He fell into a meditation, as wordless as the music of the wind. Food appeared. He ate and was satisfied, and he fell asleep and awakened so far cured that he could even see out of his damaged eye. The gringo loaded him onto a mule, and with him rode across the flats of San Carlos Valley into the northern mountains. "I think you can go on safely from here," said the gringo. "But if you are afraid, I'll stay with you the rest of the day." Fray Luis smiled.
"Dear son and brother," he said, "I have no longer any fear. Holy San Carlos himself is my companion. And how shall I thank you for the life of my body, Senor Mr. Charles?"
"Pray for me," said the gringo. "Pray the devil out of the brandy bottle. And adios." He took the hand of the friar, and Luis felt something very strange in that grasp, so that he looked and noticed that 2 fingers of Senor Charles' right hand were missing. Shot away in some battle, perhaps? While he was reflecting on this, he discovered that the gringo had disappeared to a mere sound of hoofbeats far down the valley. Fray Luis rode softly on, still with his mind fixed far off. For he had not yet been able to arrange his thoughts properly, and though he felt by the whip welts on his old body that a miracle had saved him, when he told the story to the Brotherhood, he hardly knew how to make the saint appear. So he drew on into the highlands where excellent bunch grass grew, and fat sheep wandered in grazing huddles behind their bell goats. As he rode, he touched from time to time the sacred relic in his pocket. They were safe, but only safe, he knew, because blessed San Carlos had been with him. But his memory shrank from the death of Domingo, for whom he would pray, and from the face of the gringo, half bloated like the jowls of a swine, and half hard like the beak of a vulture. He turned his mind then to smaller things, since the holy saints often reveal themselves in the slightest events whose significance is appreciated only by the most understanding minds. And it was in this manner that he came to think of the name of the gringo, from whose right hand 2 fingers were missing.
"Senor Mr. Charles."
And all at once a mighty light burst upon the brain of the old friar, for the name and the missing fingers joined suddenly to make the miracle complete in his mind. He slipped down from the mule and fell upon his knees, overweighted by the divine conclusion which was forced upon him. May not the most glorious deliverers take the strangest forms? And did not this miracle carry its sign and authentication upon its very forehead? He knew only a few words of English, but now the name Charles rang back and forth through his brain, for surely it was the equivalent of Carlos in the sweet Spanish tongue. The dreadful and mighty revelation rushed upon Fray Luis and pressed him down upon his knees. He had been in the presence of a fleshly incarnation of the blessed saint himself, not shining with an effulgence too bright for the human eye to endure, but darkened and dimmed by the flesh and the brandy bottle, and striking his foes down not with a silent death, but through the more obvious mouth of a revolver. A single detail now remembered bolted strongly home the conviction of Fray Luis, for he recalled that Senor Mr. Charles had not sighted the gun. Blindly he had fired it, knowing that the sacred bullet would find its own way. Tears of joy began to pour down the face of the old man, but though his eyes were blinded, he had a bright inward vision of all the brotherhood, as they would sit enraptured when he told them his story, and when he showed them the sacred finger bones and told of the living hand from which they had come. While he still was blinded by joy, he did not know that a sheep-dog ran barking through the flock, scattering the sheep and their bell-wethers here and there. When Fray Luis therefore heard a sound of bells, it seemed to him that the chimes of San Carlos were sending the ghosts of their voices after him, music softly echoing among the hills and valleys of time, repeated with infinite small tongues, and every separate tremor of sound that touched his ears was to him another blessing heaped upon him by the infinite largesse of heaven, so that he seemed to be kneeling in a shower of gold.
Thank you for choosing a DH Audio production. Look for other DH Audio programs at your local retailer, call toll-free at 1-800-962-5200, or visit our website at www.dhaudio.com.